All right, welcome back to Intro to the Web 3223. We're going to be going over JavaScript today. So this is going to be the primary focus of the course, and it is the thing that we've been building up to. Part of the reason why we went so quick through the first sections is because all three of these technologies work together to represent what we know of the web today. It doesn't do us any good to focus on HTML for 4 or 5 weeks when you need the other sections as well. And then especially if you get to the end of the semester and, hey, let's pretend that we went over JavaScript. Okay, we can't do that, and we're definitely not doing that for this one. So if you're taking the Alfred State version in person, more than likely we got to this topic around week 3 or 4. So that gives us basically 2/3 of the semester to focus on building the curriculum and the software and actually doing something meaningful. And then walking out of this course, you should be able to do something, again, meaningful, reasonable, not just very tutorial based 20-minute things that you don't really understand. Okay, so that is the intent of the course. And then we're going to start getting into some of the harder concepts that are all very interdependent on each other. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into this little presentation here. So we do have to ask the question first of what is JavaScript? Well, first and foremost, it is a programming language. And if you remember correctly, the other two technologies that we've been using up to this point were HTML and CSS, neither of which are programming languages. All right. JavaScript allows for functionality of the website. So typically this is based on user interaction. So if I click on a button to buy something, I want that thing to buy something. And now that thing is an abstraction of reality. So when that button clicks, you're going to be going through a list of things to actually buy whatever that item was on Amazon, right? So that click is a representation of something, okay? One of the primary differences of JavaScript between all the other, well, not all the other, but the vast majority of the other programming languages is that JavaScript is single-threaded. Now, this is because when JavaScript was made back in 95, I believe, one, it was made quickly, but two, it was made for the web. And at the time, our consumer CPUs only had one thread. So why have a multi-threaded language if it's going to be ran on consumer hardware? Okay, well, it is now 2022 as I'm recording this, and as it turns out, basically everything that we have has at least 2 cores to it and at least 2 threads. So we officially are in the spot where, you know, maybe it doesn't make as much sense to have a single-threaded language. And towards the end of the course, we'll show you how to fix this problem through web workers. But for the time being, and what you're going to see online from everywhere else, JavaScript is a single-threaded language, and for all intents and purposes, it is. Okay? So JavaScript is also based on events. So when something happens on the DOM that a user triggers, based on that trigger or based on that event, do something. Okay, so JavaScript is essentially going, okay, I'm going to observe states, and then based on that state, we're going to do something with it. Okay, so when it comes to programming languages and programming for the web, it becomes more about managing abstractions and states than actually just doing this thing or a script. So if you're a networking student, you've probably gotten used to the point of, I'm going to run this command and it's going to magically do this thing for me. Well, we need to start stepping away from that idea, because unfortunately that's not how things are built. You're just using someone else's work. Okay, so all events are put into the event loop. We'll go over that in a second. JavaScript is non-blocking / asynchronous. We will go over that here in a second. All right. Object-oriented, like all the other programming language at Alfred State. Some of the new programming languages that are coming out are object-oriented like. They're not true implementations of object-oriented. So think Rust is like this, and Golang is like this, and we'll see what ends up coming out later on, because it does kind of seem like that pendulum is swinging back, where classes aren't the end-all be-all anymore. Okay, and JavaScript is softly typed language. So this is essentially saying that our variables can be dynamic. So you don't have to have an integer. That thing that you named as a variable can convert from a string to an integer. So we'll show you how that's valuable here in a second. And then we'll also show you how that is actually terrible in a lot of ways. So again, we'll show you both sides. So here's a little example of JavaScript adding functionality here. So I'm going to click on Sunday. That little animation there was JavaScript. Having this drop down was JavaScript. Clicking Submit Sunday was JavaScript. The message that's going to show up here in a second is JavaScript. Okay, so edit complete. All right, and then we're going to go over to services, and then we're going to make sure that this thing actually worked. We're adding time slots. That is all JavaScript. Okay, we're going to hit submit changes again. That is JavaScript. There is not a way for HTML and CSS to do this. This is all JavaScript. So these web applications that you've gotten used to using over time, where you just, oh, it's a website that does the thing that I think it should. All of that is JavaScript, and all of that is programming. Okay, so as we're getting through the rest of this video here, I really want you guys to think about how much work goes into all these interactions. So every single button has to be created and have particular set of rules to them. So another thing, so one of the things I haven't shown here, it doesn't look like I'm going to show, is that if I remove all the time slots, well, I don't want that button of remove time slot there once there's only one left. Okay, so we have rules based on when this button can actually be shown. So there's a bunch of states even within those buttons or those interactions that we got to keep track of as well. So this side of programming, if you're doing a true web application, is equally as complicated as any back-end program. Okay, traditionally speaking, the reason why a lot of your back-end developers haven't respected front-end as much is because that we traditionally lived in the ballpark of HTML and CSS, and you just do this little tag and yay, it works. Okay, we are long past that. There are very, very, very few websites out there that you're building from scratch that is just static and you don't need JavaScript at all. Very few of those. And the ones that are like that are probably being built by Wix anyways. So yeah, we've really moved on from that. Okay, so here's a little example of JavaScript. Obviously, you're not going to understand what this is right offhand, but here's that toggle animation. So when we clicked on the button and then it had the slide down, this is what it took to get that. All right, take a quick look at that. All right, JavaScript event loop. So this little presentation here, I took the sound out because I just wanted the animation really. So what this loop is, the circle represents the event loop, and that little white block represents a CPU tick. So this is going to get slowed down so we can actually talk through it. I also want to point out this little white gate thing here. Okay, so there's two sides of this event loop, and when the other side comes up, I'll show it to you. So the left side is the client rendering stuff. So stuff that is triggered by the user, stuff that is, stuff that's triggered by the user. Okay, so we have a task, which is over here. We have a task, we have a task. So when this white block finally gets over here, it's going to execute a task on a single tick of the CPU. It's going to come back around, hit that other task for the single tick of the CPU. So what I mean by tick here is that every single cycle of the CPU can only do one task. All right. hence the single-threaded nature of JavaScript. So what's coming up next on the right side is the rendering steps for the browser itself, okay? So this is going to be tied mostly to the monitor, and to keep things simple, we'll leave it at that. So you're going to have your styles, your layout, and then your paint, okay? So, excuse me, that's structure layout paint. Come over here, structure layout paint. Okay, and that's going to happen most monitors at 60 frames per second. We have a bunch of displays now that are dynamic, or they're even higher. So like 144 hertz gaming monitor. So that's going to refresh every 144 times per second. So what's going to come up here is a demonstration of the single-threaded nature of JavaScript. So he's going to hit this loop here, and while true, which the bool will always be true, the DOM stops. So one of the things we really need to point out here is that JavaScript, even though you didn't make it, everything that you interact with the browser is done by JavaScript. So if you have a task that you can never complete, the browser is not broken. It's just going to continue this task for infinity. All right. So according to the user, this is broken, but this is something that we have to be very, very, very careful of when we're actually programming our websites, because this can easily happen. I can't tell you how many times I've done an endless loop. Okay. So with that said, that's all I wanted out of that animation. Hopefully this makes sense from a event loop standpoint. All right. So this is the nature of JavaScript. Okay, so the key takeaways here: task can block any type of renders. It can block basically everything else. So if you land on a task and it can't be completed, that website's basically dead. Okay, so you need to be very, very careful about how you are addressing particular task in JavaScript. So if you have a little bit more honest example, or a little bit less, if something gets put into production, one of the things that could end up happening is that you try to make a request from an API, and then you're essentially telling the JavaScript and the rest of the DOM going, hey, when we get something back from that API, go ahead and render this thing. And maybe we're dependent on that API data. And what ends up happening, it will happen eventually, is that API is not going to respond. Either their server is going to be down, or your key is expired, or something along those lines. It's going to happen. And then your website doesn't work. Okay, that's a little bit more innocent of an example. Something that can easily be put in production and you just didn't think about it, especially if you have pressure put on you to get something out the door. Okay, the other thing is that most tasks will be performed asynchronously. Okay, so if you have something that falls under the asynchronous nature, so we're talking IO, so any type of network request, any type of file request, any type of IO, that's going to be asynchronous. So what's going to happen is that JavaScript is going to send a request to the system. It's going to make a system call. The system is going to go do that thing that it requested of it. It's going to give back a response. And then once we get back that response, JavaScript will finish out that task. Okay, so that's asynchronous. And that's going to be the most common. The other things are going to be IO is basically it. Rendering is another one where it's asynchronous, but it's almost immediate. Yeah, so just for your level, stay at IO. IO is asynchronous. Okay. JavaScript is asynchronous. How about that? Okay, so what we need to talk about here is the order that this is going to be processed in. So I'm going to make a call out here. Set timeout tells the function here. So set timeout, we're going to pass in a function, and then we're going to run that function based on how long we told it to timeout for. Okay, so this is going to go into the event loop, but then we'll come back to it. So this is quite literally asynchronous in this purest form. All right, so what's going to happen here? All right, let's take a second here. Is this So we got 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second. Is this going to go in order? Step 1, step 2, step 3. The answer is no, it's going to go in the exact opposite order. And the reason for that is that this timeout is going to trigger first, and then this one for step 2, and then this one for step 3 or step 1. Okay. And this is going to be the third one. So you can easily end up in a scenario where you're waiting on some sort of IO function, and then you're going to try to render before that IO actually gets a response, and then you're going to go, well, what went wrong? Okay, so this is a common one. This is a better example of what we are talking about. So this fetch call is an IO call. This is a network request to a server, and we're looking for root. So root, and we're going to send a message of post with a body of JSON stringify. Okay, and then we're giving it a handful of data here, and then we're going to get back a response. So awesome. Now, one of the things I do need to call out here is, what do you think is going to happen first? Are we going to get this response back first? Or are we going to get this alert waiting for post first? The text kind of gives it away, but you're definitely going to get waiting for post first. Okay. Submit. Yay, waiting for post. Okay, and there's all the data. All right, so hopefully that was a good enough example where you understand it. Okay, this is where we're going to have to talk about where everything is an object. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this later on in the course, but for the time being, try to wrap your head around this because it is confusing. It's a brain twister trying to figure this out the first time looking at it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to tell you to ignore this top bit for a second. Just know that it's a function, okay? We have a second function down here, log console, passed function, okay? So we're passing in a function. We're going to run passed function, okay? Then we're going to pass in that test function. So stay with me here. We created the function here. We're going to pass in the function, this test function down here. We're going to pass in test. We're going to convert that name into passed, and then we're going to run the converted name. So the way this works is this is just a pointer in memory. So, hey, pointer in memory, we're going to give this a pointer in memory. We're going to change the name of that pointer in memory, and then we're just going to run that function. Okay, so if I click play here, all right, passed function. Okay, so we're hitting this function first down here, and then we're going to run this logging. Okay, so not only is this, well, technically not asynchronous, but you're literally passing a function. So you can't do this in your typically object-oriented programming languages like a Java or a C#. Okay, let's move on from this. JavaScript variables. So the big one here that we need to talk about is the dynamic nature of the variable. So because it's softly typed, we can change a variable name to anything. Okay, so in the most basic form of JavaScript, this is awesome. Anything outside of the most basic form, it is awful. It's just the way it goes, okay? And the creator of JavaScript has actually talked about this quite a bit. And he said that he made it really, really fast. And he made JavaScript as flexible as possible so you can actually work around the problems that he just didn't have time to fix. Now, JavaScript has come a long ways since 1995, but that dynamic, flexible nature is still there. So this typically ends up in two camps. If you're talking to the people that are in the JavaScript life, they go, well, I really like the flexible nature. So even when my business requests something of me that is almost patently ridiculous, I have the best shot at doing it through JavaScript. And maybe it's awful. Yeah, maybe in every single way is not the right thing to do, but at least it works. Okay. And then the other side of that argument is, yeah, I would much rather have a programming language that forces me to do the right thing. And then, because even if you do have those business goals and pressures, the language will keep you from shooting yourself in the foot, in theory. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little example here about being softly typed and dynamic. So right here is a good example of this. So I have first name of Justin. All right, I have this function down here, and then I'm going to reset this to a bool of true, and then I'm going to console log that first name. Okay, so for the people that are participating in this, go ahead and do a little mental note of your guess. What do you think the value of first name is going to be down here? Okay, setting first name is a string of Justin. All right, we got this line. And my name is true. So, okay. So what's happening here, and this is a scoping thing. We'll have a separate scoping presentation here in a little while. So first name, we're going to set it to a string of Justin. We're going to run, this is a self-initiating function. We're going to run this function, and we're going to reset this first name, which is just a pointer. So we're going to reset this pointer first name to a bool of true. And then we're going to come down here and we're going to count to log this. So after this hits down here, this string of Justin is no longer there. Okay, so this is definitely a bool of true. So I probably should go over these. So that gives you a little bit of a scoping example, but it also highlights the dynamic nature of JavaScript variables. So the list of these variables are bool, number, string, null, undefined, and object. So a couple of things we need to go over here. Bool, string, null, all the same as your typical languages. Number, because of the dynamic nature of JavaScript, the language itself will give it the correct container. So if you only need an int 8 or an int 16 for your number, it will do that for you. Okay. If you need a double or a float or, int 64 or something like that, the JavaScript will do it for you. You don't really have to think about it too hard. So you're not wasting memory in that regard. Okay. All right. Undefined is when JavaScript goes into memory and it didn't find it. It's undefined. We didn't find it. Okay. Object is kind of what it sounds like. So this is an object. This is an object. The keys that you can hear are an object. This mouse is an object. So basically it's a representation of anything, which makes this object or this thing that's called an object confusing. Typically speaking, this is a function, typically. Sometimes it can be a file, though. Sometimes it can be a server response. Okay, so object is very, very vague, but what else are you going to name it? Okay. Boolean, true or false, just like every other programming language. Moving on. Number. I already talked about this for a bit. It's going to dynamically assign whatever width in terms of memory bandwidth you need for that number. Strings, same thing. Null. Null represents an empty object. It does mean that it was defined, okay, but it represents an empty object. So the little example that I have over here to the right is where I use null quite a bit, is when I need to set something to something, right? Where I can't compare it to undefined because that's going to give me nothing. It's going to throw an error. It has to be something, okay? So if that something has to be, well, anything but a date, in this case, well, I'm going to set that to null, so that at least the first iteration of that loop is going to work. So, and this is what I'm talking about. So that last day equal null, and then I'm going to come down here, last day does not equal current day, which the first time through is going to be a guarantee, do this thing. Okay. And then down here, I can set last day to current day. So now we're inside of that loop and it can function as it's intended to do. Okay. Undefined. I already talked about this for a bit. Variable with search for and never found. Okay. And then scopes. Okay, scope is a little different from most of your programming languages. Most of your programming languages are going to force you to define a variable and your functions before you actually use them. No such thing in JavaScript. This is called hoisting. This is also where you run into problems as well. Now we'll get into that with the scoping demonstration, but this right here is natural inheritance. So inheritance, right here, this first name, this function is within the scope of this first name. Okay, and this is part of the reason why you don't want to use global variables, because as soon as you start using functions inside of that global space, which is every single one of them, suddenly you have the opportunity to inject bugs that you don't want to because you name something similar, right? So the most common variable name is data. That's not particularly awesome, but it highlights the problem with having global scopes because there are common names. Okay. Okay, scopes in JavaScript. I already rambled about this. Inheritance, okay? So this particular slide right here, gave you guys a second to look at it. If you pass in another name, which we're going to redefine this to other name, you can reset that pointer. You can give it a new pointer doing it this way. All right. So scopes in this case, for the rest of this, we're going to have an entire presentation on this. But in this particular case, I want you guys to I want you guys to think about all right, so scopes, we're going to have an entire presentation on scopes, but this particular thing right here, I want you guys to take a second and look at it, and I want to point out this right here. If you pass in a variable, okay, you'll create a new pointer for it. So we have other name, we are going to pass in first name, other name, and here we go. So down here, we have a very similar count log, except for we have first name, and then we have other name. So what do you think the value of other name is going to be? Give you a second to think about that. Well, the value of other name is undefined because it was not defined within that scope. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. And the more that you program, the easier that this concept gets. Okay, scope modifiers, let. This can get out of hand. I still recommend that you don't use let unless you need to. But if you have a variable name that you absolutely want to use, and maybe you have to use it for some reason, and it's conflicting with another variable named the same thing inside of the same scope, you can reset that variable name so it has its own defined scope. Okay, so and this is how you do that. So first name of Justin inside of this little scope here, so every function has its own scope. Let first name equal true. Okay, and then we're going to come down here, and then we're going to go count log first name. And what do you think the value is going to be? My name is Justin. Okay, so this is a highlight of how you control scope and the tools that you actually have with JavaScript. And yes, a lot of this is reasonably confusing, and it's going to take some time to parse it all out and figure it out for yourself and be fluent with it. But that comes with time. Don't worry about it too much. Okay, this. I do not like this keyword, and I probably never will. Uh, it lends itself to very, very messy and not very readable code. There are scenarios where you have to use this keyword of this, and that's going to be inside of a strict environment. So when we get to web components, we're going to have to use this a lot. But outside of the things where you have to use it, I rarely recommend that you don't. But this is here, and you're going to see it online, and you guys need to be aware of it because it is something that is current and used. It's just not used properly. Okay, so that's going to do it for this little intro to JavaScript. That was a lot of information all at once. Do not worry about it too much because we're going to be going over with a lot of demonstrations how to actually do these things. And when you start doing your projects, it'll get easier. Okay. With that said, when you do your projects and you have JavaScript assignments, give yourself time. Okay. You can easily run into a roadblock where you get nowhere for 6 hours. Don't play with fire. Don't do this Friday morning and think you're going to turn it in Friday night, because there's a decent chance that you won't. Okay. So with that said, I will see you in the next one, which I believe is scopes. So see you then.